Madhava Kunja Bihari Gopi Janabalabha Giri Baradari Iya Soda Nandana Brajajana Ranjana Yamunatira Banachari Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama Hare Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Vishnupad, Paramhamsa Paramajakacharya Atto Sarasata Shri Śrimad, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki, Grantaraj Śrimad Bhāgavatam Ki, Samveda Bhaktivedanta Ki, and whole Premananda. All glories to some devotees, all glories to some devotees, all glories to some devotees, all glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Gaura. Yeah, Hare Krishna. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Anmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Guruve Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Shtapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Pada Kamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakanvitam Chab Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, just a second. So today we are on Canto 3, Chapter 26, Text 18, if I understood correctly. Is that right? That what's on the board? Yeah. Anta Purusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam. Please chant. Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Bhagavan Atmamayayam Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam. Vaishnavis. Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam Antapurusha Rupena Kala Rupena Yobahi Samanvetesha Satvanam Bhagavan Atmamayayam Anta within Purusha Rupena, in the form of the Supersoul. Kala Rupena, in the form of time. Yaha, he who. Bahihi, without. Samanveti, exists. Eshaha, he. Sattvanam, of all living entities. Bhagavan, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Atma Mayaya, by his potencies. So, the translation reads, by exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as Supersoul and without as time. So responsibly we can read, by exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as a Supersoul and without as time. So Prabhupada's purport is here. Here it is stated that within the heart of the Supreme Personality of Godhead resides as the Supersoul. This situation is also explained in Bhagavad Gita. The Supersoul rests beside the individual soul and acts as witness. This is confirmed elsewhere in Vedic literature. Two birds are sitting on the same tree of the body. One is witnessing and the other is eating the fruit of the tree. This Purusha or Paramatma, who resides within the body of the individual soul, is described in Bhagavad Gita 13:23 as Upadrashta, witness, and Anumanta, sanctioning authority. The conditioned soul engages in the happiness and distress of the particular body given him by the arrangement of the external energy of the Supreme Lord. But the Supreme Living Being, or the Paramatma, is different from the conditioned soul. He is described in Bhagavad Gita as Maheshwara, or the Supreme Lord. He is Paramatma, not Jivatma. Paramatma means the Supersoul, who is sitting by the side of the conditioned soul just to sanction his activities. The conditioned soul comes to this material world in order to lord it over material nature, since one cannot do anything without the sanction of the Supreme Lord. He lives with the Jiva soul as witness and sanction giver. He is also Bhokta. He gives maintenance and sustenance to the conditioned soul. Since the living entity is constitutionally part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the Lord is very affectionate to the living entities. Unfortunately, when the living entity is bewildered or illusioned by the external energy, he becomes forgetful of his eternal relationship with the Lord. But as soon as he becomes aware of his constitutional position, he is liberated. The minute independence of the conditioned soul is exhibited by his marginal position. If he likes, he can forget the Supreme Personality of Godhead and come into the material existence with a false ego to lord it over material nature. But if he likes, he can turn his face to the service of the Lord. The individual living entity is given that independence. His conditioned life is ended, and his life becomes successful as soon as he turns his face to the Lord. But by misusing his independence, he enters into material existence. Yet the Lord is so kind that as Supersoul, he always remains with the conditioned soul. The concern of the Lord is neither to enjoy nor suffer from the material body. He remains with the jiva simply as sanction giver and witness, so that the living entity can receive the results of his activities, good or bad. Outside the body of the conditioned soul, the Supreme Personality of God remains as the time factor. According to the Sonka system of philosophy, there are 25 elements. The 24 elements already described, plus the time factor, make 25. According to some learned philosophers, the supersoul is included to make a total of 26 elements. Antapurusha rupena kala rupena yobahi samanvetyesha satvanam bhagavanatma mayaya. By exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Personality of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as the supersoul and without as time. So this world that we live in is a kind of mysterious place. We are born, we come out of the womb, and we wonder what's going on here. And it's not at all obvious what's going on here. Certain things are obvious, but they're not correct. So the material world certainly has a first face, or what it appears to be, but behind the scenes, we soon come to realize as we live our lives that the material world is not exactly what it appears to be. It appears like we are in a place where there are all kinds of interesting sense objects and experiences to have, and by having these we will be happy. That's what appears to be going on. But it doesn't actually work, or it doesn't work out that way very often. We mostly find that we are suffering, bored, lost, fearful, anxiety-ridden, uncomfortable, and a number of other usually negative states of consciousness. So outside, there's a great kala, or time factor. And time factor is moving everything. There's a great, sometimes it's called a wheel of time, because according to the dates and the motions of the sun and the moon, our time is measured. And as time clicks by, we find ourselves losing moment after moment of our duration of life until one day time's up and that's it. We have finished our duration of life. We are no more in this body. We get kicked out of this body by material arrangement. And time is so mysterious. It seems to move in one direction, and we think we understand it, but things happen that we didn't expect. And as each time the sun raises up and lowers down, we find ourselves more wrinkles, less agile, more bodily misfunctions and malfunctions. And this causes us disturbance, but we kind of ignore it and carry on. Within, however, is the supersoul, and the supersoul is ready to give us knowledge, but he will only give us knowledge if that's what we want. So we have mata smriti jnanam apohanam cha. If we want knowledge, we can have it. If we want ignorance, we can have that. It's our choice. And if we sometimes want knowledge and sometimes want ignorance, we can have that too. We can bounce back and forth between ignorance and knowledge. And most of us do that once we've engaged in at least learning about Krishna consciousness. Before we learn anything about Krishna consciousness, we're solid in the mode of Iggy. we just love that ignorance, and we try to enjoy the object of the senses, even though it doesn't work out most of the time. That's what we're up to. Now, one of the verses that is being hinted at here, although Prabhupada does not quote it in the purport, is that verse that everybody's been quoting in this whole section, that very famous verse, Krishna Bahirmukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare Nikatastamayatari Japatiya Dari, which is from the Prema Vivart. Krishna Bahirmukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare Nikatastamayatari Japatiya Dari. And where is that? I think that it's Śrimad Bhāgavatam 10.7.1. Purport. So, as stated in Prema Vivarta, Krishna Bahirmukha Haya Bhogavanchakare Nikatastamaya Tare Japatiya Dhare. Our material existence is Maya, or illusion, in which we desire different varieties of material enjoyment, and therefore change to different varieties of bodies. So, it basically is saying that when the living entity turns his face away from Krishna and wants to enjoy the material nature, Maya slaps him down into material existence. And this is our plight. We are lost in the material world. And there's a similar verse, which is, I was always struck by how similar this verse is. It's in the CC, Madhya Lila 20, text 117. Krishna Bhuli se jiva anandi Bahirmukha Ata eva mayatari deya samsara dukkha. Almost all the same words are there. They're in a somewhat different order. Krishna Bhuli se jiva anadi Bahirmukha Ata eva mayatari deya samsara dukkha. Forgetting Krishna, the living entity has been attracted by the external feature from time immemorial. Therefore, the illusory energy Maya gives him all kinds of misery in his material existence. So, Prabhupada mentions the whole concept of facing Krishna, and he talks about this idea of the two birds in the tree, and that's in Bhagavad Gita. We find that in Bhagavad Gita, 2nd chapter, verse 20 in the purport, we hear about the idea that there are two souls, not one, but two souls in the body. So this X's out, crosses out the possibility that the Mayavadis are correct, that there's only one soul, and the living entity is indeed the Supreme Personality of Godhead Himself. So this aborts that possibility. Then 2 verses later, in 222, we hear this verse that Prabhupada is quoting here, and it's quoted from both the Svetasvatara Upanishad and the Katha Upanishad, I believe it is, 222. Samani vrikshe purusho nigama nimmagno nishaya sochati muhyamana jushtam yada pashyati anam isham asya mahimanam iti vita shoka. Although the two birds are in the same tree, the eating bird is fully engrossed in anxiety and moroseness as the enjoyer of the fruits of the tree. But if in some way or other he turns his face, again we have this idea of turning his face, to his friend who is the Lord and knows his glories, at once the suffering bird becomes freed from all anxieties. So this is a very striking example. And there's a nice painting that was done early on in ISKCON, which shows the two birds sitting in the tree. And I often show it when I'm doing my classes on Bhagavad Gita. So this idea is there, that there are two birds. One is the witnessing bird, and as Prabhupada says, the witnessing bird is also Upadrashta and Anumanta, which is from 13th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. So I think it's 13:23. So that verse is the one that describes Upadrashtanumantas cha, that the Supreme Lord is also seated in the heart. And there, of course, in the 13th chapter, Krishna does an elaborate presentation of the fact that there's not just one soul, that there is the Atma and the Paramatma, that we are not one with God, and that there are two beings there. So we see that there's no brokering this Mayavad philosophy. In the Upanishads, in Bhagavad Gita, in Śrimad Bhāgavatam, in Chaitanya Charitamrita, so many places we hear the idea that we are not the Supreme, that within the heart there is the Atma, the individual Jiva soul, and there's also the Paramatma. Yet this Mayavadi concept is so ingrained in our everyday world, so ingrained. In fact, the idea that the Supreme Lord has no form is a key element of some major religions. From, if we take a look around, we find that essentially both Islam and Judaism have a notion that the Supreme Lord has no form. This is quite strong. Even though the Bible explains that man is made in the image of God, which suggests there's certainly an image. In his book, Om Shalom, Satyaraj mentions he was talking to a rabbi, and they are discussing the topic in Om Shalom. And it seems that there was Moses Maimonides, okay, now I can get the word out of my mouth, or sometimes called Rambam. So Moses Maimonides, who was very strong on the idea that if God is a person, then he can't be God. Because if we see, the bodily feature of the Supreme Lord, if you just go a few inches above his head, that's not him. Which, of course, is a complete misunderstanding of the whole ontology of the Supreme. So he was certain that when the Bible describes the Supreme Lord as having actual physical features, that this could not be true. This was just metaphorical. However, in this book, Om Shalom, the rabbi that Satyaraj is talking to describes that there was another rabbi who was completely against Moses Maimonides' concept. He was completely against it. And he said that when the Bible says the Supreme has form, it means that literally, that he actually has form. However, history remembers Moses Maimonides and does not remember, let me see if I can think of his name. It may come to me in a minute, but I didn't specifically try to refresh my memory of that, of his name. But we find that Islam also is very strong on the idea that there is no form to God. God cannot have a form. So in other words, these religions are locked into the Burman feature of the Supreme, the formless feature of God. And we know, and we've been talking about it here in the classes in this particular section of Śrimad Bhāgavatam, that from Krishna's effulgence, or from Krishna generates his effulgence, the Brahman. From Brahman, when mixed with the modes of goodness, passion, ignorance, we get what we call the pradhan. We were talking about that yesterday, Mother Nanda was talking about that. And then when that becomes agitated by the time factor again, then we get what's known as the Mahatat, or the Prakriti, material energy. So the Brahman and the material energy, which is what everything is made out of, all material elements are made from this basic substance called Prakriti in various features and permutations. And this is the Supreme Lord. However, it is not the only aspect of the Supreme Lord. In Bhāgavatam we have Vadanti tat tattva vidhas tattvam yajganam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabdyate, that the Supreme is known in three features as Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. And from Vaishnava theology, we learn that the Bhagavan feature of the Supreme is actually the key, the important feature. The Brahman and the Paramatma are secondary and not so important features. Even the Brahman is subordinate to the Paramatma, which is a feature of God, which has a personality or a personal aspect to it. But it is not the most important feature. The most important feature is Bhagavan, because the Bhagavan feature one can have a relationship with, and that's what actually counts. The living entity is ignorant of these things, and unless the living entity comes in contact with this philosophy, as Kapila Dev is describing in his philosophy of Sankhya, unless the living entity comes in contact with this philosophy, he will miss the purpose of life. He will not get an understanding of who he is, what he is, and how to turn his face, as we're hearing in this verse, towards the witnessing bird. And Prabhupada also mentions Bhokta, that the Supreme Lord is not only Upadrashta and Anumanta, but he's also Bhokta, which means the enjoyer, or also the facilitator. So the Supreme Lord is the real enjoyer, and we enjoy when we try to help or facilitate the Supreme Lord's enjoyment, which is, thumbnail sketch of what Krishna consciousness is all about. So we live in a world where none of this is known by common people. People don't know that they're not the body. People don't know that the super soul is within their body, just like their own soul is within their body. People don't know they've turned their face away from Krishna and are trying to enjoy the fruits of material activity, which, as mentioned in this sloka, is suffering. Suffering and enjoyment. Little bit as our Yugal Kishores always want to point out, a little bit of enjoyment and big chunk of suffering. So we have this reality. Of course, when a person takes the spiritual life, they start experiencing happiness from within that makes the external world seem no longer so problematic and no longer so filled with miseries. We actually begin to enjoy, but we enjoy in a different way than people who try to enjoy the material world directly. So people have no understanding of any of these things. And that's why Sankhya philosophy is necessary. We have to learn how the material world works. Oftentimes, many religions are aware of the fact that the world is, can cause us to suffer, but they're unaware of how the material world actually is constituted, how it functions, particularly the feature we call karma. So material scientists, they study all kinds of active principles in the material world. F equals ma, it's a very important, principle or equation that was given to us by Isaac Newton, that force equals mass times acceleration. So this is how they build rocket ships, how they make locomotive trains, how they discover how many RPM the automobile's engine has to do to be able to travel at a certain speed on the highway. So this is a very important principle, but they do not understand the principle of karma, which is as we act materially for our own benefit only, we become gradually more and more bound up, create more and more bad karma, and then our suffering increases naturally. And it's not an accident that accidents happen. It's actually a part of the whole way that everything works, that when something happens and it causes suffering or disturbance to one person, but the person right next to them is completely untouched. This is karma making its effect in human society. As Prabhupada uses an example, that sometimes there's a fire and two houses burn, one on one side and one on the other side of a house, but the house in between doesn't burn. So why should that be if material principles are only mechanical? So we find that there are all kinds of odd things that happen because it isn't just F equals ma. It isn't just the, Maxwell's equations of electrodynamics. It's not just Bernoulli's equations of wind and force. These equations of karma are very important because unless we take and get an understanding of them through Sankhya philosophy and begin the process of devotional service, we will just go down and down and down. Of course, Krishna says these same things in Bhagavad Gita, particularly in chapter 3 and chapter 5. So Krishna is explaining the whole process of karma and how to become disentangled in karma through devotional service. And again, here, this is the same thing that we are looking at in today's verses in Śrimad Bhāgavatam. So Devahuti had been asking about the process of Sankhya, or the philosophy or knowledge structure known as Sankhya. And Capila, her son, had explained some aspects of it to her. And then she asked more questions in verse 9 of this particular chapter of Śrimad Bhāgavatam, chapter 26. And now from 10 onward, we're in 18 today, we're hearing more explanations of the process of Sankhya. How does it work? We're hearing about 24 elements, how reality is created. We're learning how people get tangled up through karma. And this is how, through learning about time, the Supreme Lord, our position, as I say, that we have to understand Sambandha, Abhideya, and Prayojana. So Sambandha, I say, is understanding the fix that we're in. And Abhideya is how to fix the fix that we're in. And Prayojana is where we'll be fixed when we fix the fix of material nature. So we learn first that we are in a sad way in material nature. Then we learn how to change that and engage in devotional service. And then once we do that, we learn about where we'll go as a result of perfecting ourselves or doing remedial action. All right, so questions, comments, any feedback? Do we have our microphone? So our audience at home can hear. Oh, it's not working. Working just barely. Okay. That's a good question. I think it's also a very relevant question. Let me think about it for a second here. What a good reply would be that we know that material enjoyment always fades. That's one aspect of material enjoyment, that it always is smoking more, enjoying it less principle. I mean, there I'm giving away my age. That was a cigarette commercial many decades ago, and only people who grew up in America maybe saw that. They used to say that now you're smoking. Are you smoking more and enjoying it less? Come to Lucky Strikes or whatever it was. I forget which brand of cigarette came up with that. But that's the nature of all material enjoyment. That when you enjoy on a material level, you have to do more and more of the same thing to enjoy, and it starts to get hackneyed. But when you enjoy spiritually, it's not like that at all. That you feel satisfaction, and you don't feel at all bored or this diminishing return kind of concept. Because if one's genuinely engaged in devotional service, that deep satisfaction in the heart will just grow more and more. Of course, we, coming from material entanglement, we have all kinds of material desires, and we still enjoy various kinds of material things, which are gradually becoming overcome, as Krishna says in chapter 3, by regulating the senses. So, we ask about, Arjuna asks about lust, and we find that lust can be overcome by knowledge and by regulation. So, we have certain sense desires, and we don't starve ourselves, but we don't overeat. We don't sleep too little or sleep too much. We don't, engage in all kinds of sensual activities to the complete extreme, nor do we completely cut them off. But in general, if we're engaged in devotional service, we will find that our happiness less and less is dependent on our regulated material sense enjoyment. We're less and less, hankering for that fix that we get when we get a little bit, we get a nice meal, we sleep enough or whatever it is. We're less and less focused on that, and we're more and more focused on the general buoyancy, the happiness, the feeling of self-satisfaction that comes from engaging in devotional service. So I'm tempted to answer it. I don't know if...
I have another one. Okay. So why do we have this tendency, like just way back from the beginning, like how did that happen? Why do we have this tendency to turn away from the Lord? Like why, how does that happen?
Well, it's described that in the spiritual world, there is something called causeless unwillingness to serve. So, although there's no Maya in the spiritual world, we have this idea of free will. So somehow or other, the living entity can turn his face away from Krishna. This is the, verse that we've been talking about, Krishna Bahimukha Hanya Bhogavanchakare. So the living entity decides that why does Krishna have to be the center all the time? And just by thinking in that way, one immediately gets transported to, you guessed it, the material world. Now, generally it's said that the living entity becomes Brahma. So the living entity falling from the spiritual world becomes the creator, the main demigod, the original demigod. And there, the living entity is still actually engaged with Krishna. Brahma is having interactions with Krishna. And as a result of having interactions with Krishna, he's certainly doing devotional service. However, there's something new here, that Brahma has his own circle of attention. There are people who are serving him. So it would be possible for the living entity to realize that they made a mistake and go right back to the spiritual world. But most cases, we don't do that. Instead, we get deeper into the material world. So we're all ex-Brahmas here, and we, we're further entangled in material life. And as you get entangled in material life, your material portfolio, where your, Christmas list gets bigger and bigger. You decide, I'd like to do this, I'd like to be here, I'd like to have that, I'd like to experience that, I didn't get enough of this. And so we carry this like a suitcase in our subtle body from one lifetime to the next. And when we take birth as a result of our previous karma, the supersoul reminds us, as Prabhupada says in the purport, the supersoul reminds us of what we wanted in our previous life. So at a certain point, we are just kids and we're struggling to make the senses work. But at a certain stage, usually around puberty, around that time, the supersoul reminds the living entity of what that living entity had been searching for in previous lives, So people suddenly think, I'm going to be a death metal hard rocker, or I'm going to jump out of airplanes, or I need to join the Navy, or, it's just these, we see this happens to people. At a certain age, they just decide, this is what I need to do, and they just, rocket off in some particular direction. And this is because the supersoul has reminded the living entity of what they wanted in a previous life. So as we get more diversified in our portfolio of material interests, then there's more things and it's more complicated, and we are less satisfied with any one thing. We kind of want a whole smorgasbord of things. So it's only when a living entity is somehow or other intersected with some devotee at some point who says, hey, Bubba, wake up, that this isn't going to make you happy. And suddenly then the living entity thinks, oh yeah, well that makes sense. Let me check out this devotional service stuff, and I'll try this out for a little while. So the living entity attempts to do it and then realizes the hypnosis of the material energy, the throwing and covering potency of Maya. So when the living entity first desires to turn his face away from Krishna, then there's a avaranatmaka and prakshipatmaka potencies of Maya, the throwing and covering potencies. And when you get thrown into the material world, you're covered, and you begin to think that the whole universe is about how you can enjoy certain kinds of material sense objects. And that's what your life becomes. And as we say, it gets more and more diversified, and you get more and more karmically down in the mud of material nature as you progressively lose more and more contact with Krishna. So how would anyone ever be reclaimed except that we have the process of Sankirtan? And Sankirtan is the devotees of the Lord canvassing through the population of the world. People who are not interested in devotional service, people who don't deserve devotional service, people who have not pleased Krishna. They have all disqualifications, but the devotees don't care about those disqualifications. They rather go right up to those people and they try to convince them to take up Krishna consciousness, and some cases they actually do. So the person was saved from a glide down into hell by the intercession or the intervention of a devotee. And that's what happened to all of us. And now we are trying to pay back the favor, pay it forward, so that we are trying to help others, give them the chance to experience the same Sankhya philosophy, to turn our material life around.
Just one quick follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
So you said that in the spiritual world, we ask this, why can I not have this like Krishna? Something like that?
What is that?
You said, why can I not be like Krishna? You said this is the cause of our original turning away.
Yes, we decide that we have a kind of an enviousness of Krishna's central position. So
why, in the spiritual world, why would this thought come into a pure soul?
because there's a thing called free will. Otherwise, everybody in the spiritual world would be robots, that... although there's no gross Maya or material modes of nature in the spiritual world, there's still the possibility, the way at least it's described, of something called causeless unwillingness to serve. So everybody at any time, at any place, whether in the spiritual world or the material world, in heaven or hell or anywhere in between, they always have free will, which means that somehow or other, it must be possible, maybe we don't understand the mechanism completely, how it exactly works, but there must be some way that a person can desire to not want to serve Krishna. And the minute that thought enters our head, we cannot remain in the spiritual world. We get ejected to the material world, where it's possible to elaborate a whole life and maybe millions of lives based on the principle of wanting not to be following Krishna around or having Krishna as the center. So more than that, I can't say. There are people who claim that one cannot fall from the spiritual world, and sometimes even Prabhupada says that. But then we get into some trickiness of semantics. That Prabhupada says that we even now are in the spiritual world, but we just don't know it because we are wrongly mentally situated. So the spiritual world is actually, it subsums the material world. And if we have the right consciousness, we instantly leave the material world and realize the spiritual world, which is everywhere. And that's actually what advanced devotees do. So if a person is in a bed and that person is dreaming that they are in the jungle and a tiger is about to eat them, so we can ask the simple question, are they in the jungle? At least according to their dream and their perception, they are in the jungle. And they're very very fearful that they'll be eaten by a tiger. However, from another point of view, we know that they're lying in a bed and there's no tiger. So depends on which point of view. So in some ways, that's how this idea of whether one can fall from the spiritual world is described. That Prabhupada says that the person lying in the bed may imagine all kinds of things, but in fact, none of those things are real. It's all a dream. So our thinking that we're Joe or Jane somebody in the material world is a dream. And when we become purified by Krishna consciousness, we wake up to the fact that I thought I was living a material life, but it's kind of a 80, 90-year daydream that I'm going through. But really, I'm a servant of Krishna. And this is not just a theoretical. This is what devotional service gives us a real deep realization of as we become more and more purified. At first it just seems theoretical, and then it seems like kind of we get the notion of it, but at advanced degrees of spiritual realization, of spiritual purity, we have a fundamental vigyan, a full realization of that we're walking around in a body, we have material duties that are incumbent on us due to our material body and the nature of where it came out and what its obligations are. But those things are kind of like a long-term dream, and that's all it is. And our real business is trying to please Radha and Krishna.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are over time, and I thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam, all glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.